As you might have heard, Framework, the company behind the highly repairable and Linux-compatible laptops, has just made a new motherboard available for its main product, the Framework Laptop 13. Up to now, nothing crazy or out of the ordinary. Framework maintains their laptops well supported and has a long history of delivering on making CPU platform upgrades over time, but this is something that does not quite pack the same punch, but for now, but that every Linux and free software enthusiast should definitively be excited about. This new motherboard is, in fact, based on the RISC-V architecture. So technically speaking, RISC-V itself is not a CPU, but an instruction set architecture, in short, ISA, that also happens to be completely free and open source. To understand what this means properly, though, we'll need to backtrack for a second and get an idea about how CPUs work. If you already have a basic background in this area, feel free to skip ahead to the next section. So, as you know, the main component in a computer system can be considered to be the CPU, the central processing unit, also known as the processor. It is easily the most important thing that's on your motherboard, as it is the component that runs instructions and makes arithmetic and logical calculations all the time to make any computer work. While modern CPUs are pretty complex and exist within the context of a system on chip, which we will talk about later, every CPU shares the same fundamental blueprint and components. The main part of the CPU is the arithmetic and logic unit, ALU for short. It's the piece of circuitry that actually computes all the mathematical operations that are required for a computer to work. The registers, a memory location that is integrated in the CPU and that can be used to briefly store values, such as the input or outputs of the result of a mathematical operation executed by the ALU. And finally, we have the control unit, CU for short, which is the component that acts as a bit of a orchestra director for your CPU. It fetches the next instruction set to run from memory, it decodes it in order to figure out what it needs to be executed, and then it executes it. As an example, feeding the operands for an operation to the ALU and having it compute the result. But what are these instructions? What kinds of instruction can the CPU execute and how are they defined? This is where the above mentioned ISA comes in. The instruction set architecture is a model that defines all aspects of how this works. It enumerates all the instructions that a CPU supports and everything related to them, such as the data types they accept as input and produce as output, the registers that they use and how they use them, and how a lot of other basic functionalities like memory handling and I/O works. Unlike all the other components that we have previously seen though, the ISA is not a physical entity that is made of transistors. It is an abstract theoretical model that defines how a CPU works. With the basic context out of the way, what is RISC-V? So, RISC-V is an ISA that is completely free and open source. Purely due to this, it fills an important position as it is one of the very few ISAs that are not proprietary. Unless you are running on a RISC-V computer or something similar, you are currently using a CPU that has a closed source ISA. It should probably be some kind of Intel or AMD processor, or maybe some kind of ARM SoC. What this means is that except for some basic facts about the architecture that have been documented by the chip maker, you do not know how it really works, and you cannot create your own compatible version on the same ISA, since you're not even licensed to do that. And even if you could, the specifics on how exactly to achieve that are tied to a trade secret and are someone else's intellectual property. This changes with RISC-V. The open ecosystem around it makes it the perfect candidate for completely free hardware that you can use, study, modify, and redistribute freely without fees or restrictions, in the same spirit Linux is distributed under. In fact, the related documents are provided under a Creative Commons license or a BSD license. So it's free as in freedom, public domain, as close it gets at least. This is a big deal. We have already seen that an ecosystem is worth more than the sum of its parts, and that the collaborative nature of open source ecosystems make technological process flourish. Just look at a Linux ecosystem, perhaps one of the healthiest ecosystems around, and home to the one piece of software that is likely to outlive us all. In the RISC-V land, a hardware manufacturer can start designing an IC integrated circuit that implements the RISC-V ISA specification and add their own extensions around it, things like PCIe and USB bus connectivity, as well as do their own experimentation and addition to the ISA. Individual players are encouraged to submit proposals for improvements to an official RISC-V board, who helps evaluate the proposals and make the ones who are found to be a good fit with the project direction to be included in future version of the ISA. This collaborative environment is closely mirrors the one of the early days of computing. It's exciting and it fosters growth. One chip manufacturer can find a performance improvement or another enhancement, and if it's a good one, then all the other manufacturers have access to it. This is exactly what helped make the RISC-V framework laptop a reality. The company had been building ICs around RISC-V, and they ultimately were able to provide the core that powers the board itself. This is a great balance. While it's not quite a far west, there is no guarantee that your change will be approved upstream, it still is leaps and bounds better than what happens on ARM land, where the ARM company owns the ISA and licensed hardware manufacturers have very little freedom on what to do with it. This climate is the opposite of collaboration, and rather than fostering growth, it often fosters drama and disagreement. A good example of that is the fact that we are still talking about the rocky relationship between ARM and Qualcomm, two companies within the same ecosystem that are in a weird dynamic where they can seem to get along, but are symbiotic in each other's growth. It is also incomparably more open than the reality in x86 land, which is fundamentally a duopoly between Intel and AMD. Another advantage over ARM is that commercial ARM boards are often very locked down, requiring proprietary drivers to be able to work properly, and very often shipping with locked bootloaders that prevent installation of other operating systems. Remember when we talked about the Snapdragon X Elite back in August? In retrospect, I might have been a little too optimistic. Linux support on that chip is not panning out well, to say the least, as Qualcomm has been really dragging their feet on their original Linux support promises, making the Linux experience on the X Elite largely a no-go several months after release. Never has any Intel or AMD chip been such in a rocky state on Linux support-wise after this much time. Qualcomm has been facing a lot of challenges on the ARM for Windows side of things, the part of the X Elite project where the money really is and where there is a binding contract with Microsoft to fulfill, and it seems like Linux has been a second thought since then. Radio silence, by the way, on the Tuxedo promised ARM-based laptop as well, it's just not panning out. By sheer contrast, Linux support on RISC-V platforms is amazing, and support for those platforms get upstreamed quickly. As a consumer, RISC-V means you get more freedom from choice, real choice, without gatekeepers like ARM, and as a power user, it means that you're no longer merely a user of your own hardware platform, but you're also potentially a developer or a designer. You're free to tinker, research, contribute, or findings back upstream for everybody's benefit, doing science like it was meant to be done. And as a Linux user, it means that you will be getting amazing platform support, where Linux is finally the first-class citizen rather than an afterthought that gets some of the feature destined to Windows systems much later, if ever, something that happens much more frequently on other platforms. Resting assured, by the way, that the upstream kernel will be enough to run your SoC just fine, with no need to fetch a patched kernel or load proprietary modules. RISC-V is not only interesting for a consumer hardware though, in fact its growth is becoming increasingly attractive for the high-performance computing field, prompting a slew of research around how RISC-V could fit into performance computing. Like this brand new August 2024 paper titled Evaluating ARM and RISC-V Architecture for High Performance Computing with Docker and Kubernetes, which explores with great detail just how promising the architecture is for serious workloads, although it still needs some time in the oven. But why is RISC-V called RISC-V? First of all, RISC-V is a reduced instruction set computer, RISC. An ISA can either be a reduced or complex instruction set architecture, or what I meant is it can be either a reduced or a complex set architecture. The most common home computers, based on the x86 family of processors, of which the most important players are AMD as Intel, as I said before, have complex instruction set architectures, CISC for short. What it means is that their ISA contains a large number of different instructions, each of which can be very powerful and represent the equivalent of running several simpler instructions consecutively. This allows the ISA to be very expressive. Just imagine that we are in the 60s, still well in the beginning of computation, and we are still mostly figuring out the best way to trick rocks into thinking. There are several limitations that computers may have, such as limited amount of memory, so programs must be very small and simple. The advantage to this approach is that the instruction set already directly targets several high-level programming concepts like calls and loops, making writing assembly code, the code that represents sequences of hardware instruction the CPU must execute in batch, potentially more comfortable, allowing programmers to collapse what would be several lines of code into just one. As a result, this approach allowed programmers to create smaller assembly programs, which used to be a very big deal in the 60s, where computers were much more memory constrained compared to today. If up to this point it looked too good to be true, that's because it was. Later on, it turned out that using complex instructions often didn't translate into the best performance, but it was possible to drastically speed up several programs by ignoring the big high-level instruction and using batches of small ones instead. This happened for several reasons, one of which being that the CPU manufacturers were so obsessed with making assembly programs shorter that the CPU microcode began to expose instructions that the CPU could not operate efficiently and quickly. Programmers didn't know that though, so they would use them anyway, blissfully unaware of how that single advertised processor operation actually costed. The RISC-V approach takes the opposite idea. RISC-V is what ARM processors, like the one on your phone, as well as RISC-V uses. We are now more into the 70s and 80s. Some of the shortcomings of CISC has been acknowledged, and we are no longer as memory constrained as we were a decade back. We can finally afford to run some slightly larger programs. The idea behind RISC is to really simplify the ISA. Only basic primitive operations are included, where each instruction takes a fixed size, and the same thing a line of CISC code achieves required several lines of simpler RISC instructions. RISC operations do not perform more than one thing, and different instructions are separated in scope. With this paradigm, performance is great. RISC computers can enjoy few simple addressing modes. All these instructions are about the same size and length, and they all take roughly the same ballpark of time to complete, making execution times much more predictable, which allows design simplifications, which often translates into even better performance in a vicious cycle. Many RISC-V based computers came and went, but CISC reigned supreme in most home computers and servers for a while, mostly due to compatibility reasons with software previously written for CISC processor, especially on the Windows platform. However, RISC has been making a comeback with ARM because it is highly performant and power efficient nature, and that makes really better than CISC for most use cases, while also making it possible to achieve good performances while running in an incredibly constrained environment of embedded devices. And smartphones still managing to get incredibly good performance with drastically more efficiently. So with less significantly heat to dissipate, finally allowing for passive cooling to be viable in a lot of situations. So there we have it. RISC-V is called like that because it's a RISC ISA. But why the V? Towards the 90s, the benefits of RISC triggered some academic curiosity, which itself birthed the publication of Computer Architecture, a quantitative approach co-authored by David Patterson, who later participated in RISC-V. This publication is a RISC ISA called DLX, which was more of a toy architecture meant for educational use. In 2010, the same David Patterson decided to aid UC Berkeley academics Chris Azanovic, who wanted to create an open source operating system as a short side project involving some graduate students. This is how the Berkeley RISC ISA was born. The small side project was meant to be only 3 months, but it turned out to be not so small, and it went through 5 different iterations. RISC-V is the name it took on its 5th iteration after being officially introduced on August 6, 2024. Well, does this not remind us of something? Linux 2 was meant to be a short hobby project, never meaning to be big or anything like that. And this is another time that a side project grew way out of its scope and became a very big deal. As the more time passed, the writing on the wall was clear. RISC-V has started providing itself as a viable platform, and it has started spreading like wildfire among thinkers and researchers due to its open source nature, which actively encourages development rather than prohibiting it. While adoption is still in its early stages, RISC-V already exists commercially in several embedded chips. As an example, those of you who are reading the framework laptop, yes, the regular CISC one, are actually using a tiny RISC-V chip every time they unlock their laptop by tapping their finger on the fingerprint reader. Fast forward to now, and we are finally starting to see some development boards, complete usable RISC-V systems that can be used by developers to start contributing to the RISC-V ecosystem or porting their software over to this new architecture. One of the main manufacturers who currently provides these devs boards is Deep Computing, the manufacturers behind the framework RISC-V board. But before we dive into Deep Computing, though, I would like to talk about today's sponsors, which is nobody, or you. Like, currently this channel is a net negative on my finances, actually, and what I do get is mostly thanks to your individual donations. You can help me out continue making videos, paying for equipment and contractors by heading to Patreon, PayPal, Ko-Fi, or LibraPay. Or even thelibranews.news, a new website which contains all of these videos in article format, and if you prefer that, and it also allows you to, subscribe to get some extra content that will arrive soon-ish. So let's get back to the video. Deep Computing is a Hong Kong-based company that was founded in 2022 for the goal of pioneering RISC-V technology. Their framework laptop mainboard is not their first rodeo. How is that pronounced? Rodeo. The company already has quite a big bit of experience in the RISC-V ecosystem between embedded and IoT products of sorts. They even have an RC car and other mainboards. Their framework mainboard is in fact based around their DC Roma SoC, which has been available in a separate development board for a while. Not only that, but a similar chipset was also integrated into another laptop solution that is called the DC Roma RISC-V laptop, this one, which is marketed to be the first laptop in the world to ship directly with RISC-V. That project is similarly exciting, especially if you consider that Canonical, Fedora, and other Linux distros have been on the board and the entire time to ensure that it gets supported properly by their images. The laptop too is more powerful than the framework board, boosting twice the RISC-V cores on its SpaceMe TK1 SoC, twice the RAM at a faster transfer rate, as well as more ports. But it's also a completely different product. It's more of a regular laptop as opposed to a framework solution, which is more focused on modularity and repairability. So we are finally ready to jump to the interesting part. How is the motherboard itself? First of all, you have to keep in mind that this chipset development board this is a chipset development board adapted into a more consumer-friendly form factor. Although it is still usable for basic tasks, it is still meant primarily for development and tinkering purposes, and it is really nothing special performance-wise compared to the more mainstream SoCs already on the market. You probably shouldn't buy this if you are expecting the snappiest performance for your daily tasks, but you probably should if you're the kind of person who wants to find out why it is not running faster yet and help figure out how to improve it. The CPU is a quad-core chip with a frequency of up to 1.5 GHz with its own imagination GPU, combined with a pretty small 8 GB of soldered-down DDR4 memory and a 64 GB micro SD card as far as storage goes. Once again, this is not going to win any performance benchmark, but it will get you running a RISC-V on a consumer laptop that you can totally take to the library and prepare your next exam on, and that's incredibly cool. Connectivity wise, things are a little closer to the more established counterparts out there. The Type-C interface supports the USB PD 3.0 protocol for charging at a maximum of 60 watts. DisplayPort 1.4 video output allows you to use this motherboard together with an external 4K monitor with no issues, all with USB 3.2 or USB 2.0 speeds. As far as the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth goes, it relies on a standard PCIe M22230 interface, and it ships with the Intel iX210 Wi-Fi 6E card, which is known to be one of the best supported VLAN cards for Linux. Aside from that, it has everything else a regular framework mainboard has: a fingerprint reader for biometric authentication and a basic audio system with laptop speakers and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Software support is already pretty good. Initial support for the RISC-V 64 architecture is there since Linux kernel version 5.17, and this specific mainboard is completely supported by Ubuntu 24.04 and Fedora 41. Additionally, as all framework motherboards, this motherboard can be used either with a framework laptop 13 or using the Framework X Coolmaster case as a mini PC in desktop mode without the need for owning an entire framework laptop to use it. This is especially useful for existing Framework 13 users who might already have an AMD or Intel motherboard installed and may want to cycle between that and the RISC-V board inside their laptops while still having the other unused motherboard available for use as a desktop PC. A particularly enthusiastic RISC-V user might decide that they do not need a ton of computer power on their laptop and use the RISC-V board inside of it full time, leaving their existing Ryzen board at home as a mini PC designed for heavier tasks, while most regular user will probably stabilize keeping the Ryzen board inside their laptop for the long haul, mostly playing with a cool RISC-V development board in a mini PC mode. This is exciting stuff. I genuinely think that what is happening with the RISC-V is a very positive and thrilling development, certainly one of the things that we should be happy and excited about, although we are living in increasingly troubled times. Personally, I hope I will be able to get my hands on this marvel of innovation sometime soon, but what I hope the most is that we will see a day where this technology reaches a state that is at least comparable to something like the Pine 64 sooner than later. Even if it would have limited support for proprietary executables due to it being a new architecture mostly focused around free software ecosystem, I would definitively love one day to be able to get away with using RISC-V laptops for at least the majority of my light daily tasks. So great work, Framework, the computing, and all the amazing people behind RISC-V. And thank you so much for watching.